What happens when one of television's most respected journalists decides to ambush a beloved royal figure on live television? You won't believe what unfolds when Princess Catherine sits down for what she thought would be a respectful conversation about her charitable work, only to find herself facing a relentless interrogation that would leave viewers around the world absolutely stunned. The tension in Studio 3A last night was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and what started as polite exchanges quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations in television history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when George Stephanopoulos decides to throw journalistic courtesy out the window and go straight for the jugular. The atmosphere in the ABC News studio was electric, as Princess Catherine gracefully took her seat across from George Stephanopoulos, her signature smile radiating warmth despite the harsh studio lights. She had agreed to this interview to discuss her groundbreaking mental health initiatives and the recent success of her early years foundation work. The Princess of Wales looked stunning in a navy blue blazer, her demeanor poised and professional as she settled into what she clearly expected to be a meaningful conversation about causes close to her heart. Stephanopoulos, however, had other plans brewing behind his practiced television smile. The veteran journalist sat rigidly in his chair, his notes spread before him like ammunition, his eyes carrying an intensity that suggested this would be far from the supportive platform Catherine had been promised. The show's producers had clearly briefed him differently than what Catherine's team had been told, and the disconnect was about to create television gold. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for joining us tonight," Stephanopoulos began, his voice carrying that familiar, authoritative tone that had made him a household name. "I know you're here to discuss your charitable endeavors, but I think our viewers deserve to hear about some of the more pressing issues surrounding the monarchy right now." Catherine's smile flickered for just a moment, a barely perceptible shift that revealed her surprise at the opening gambit. She had been briefed that this would focus on her work with children and families, not dive into controversial territory. But years of royal training kicked in as she maintained her composure. "Of course, George. I'm always happy to discuss the important work we're doing," she replied, her voice steady and diplomatic. "The Early Years Foundation has made remarkable progress in supporting families across the Commonwealth, and I'm particularly excited about our new mental health resources for young mothers." Stephanopoulos leaned forward slightly, his expression hardening. "That's admirable work, certainly, but let's address the elephant in the room. Your family has been facing unprecedented scrutiny lately, particularly regarding transparency and public accountability. Some critics argue that the royal family operates in an outdated bubble, disconnected from the real struggles of ordinary people." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Catherine's media training had prepared her for difficult questions, but the aggressive tone and the way Stephanopoulos had completely dismissed her charitable work to pivot to controversy caught her off guard. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she processed the ambush she was walking into. "I think that's an unfair characterization, George," Catherine responded, her voice remaining calm but gaining a subtle edge. "William and I work tirelessly to understand and address the real challenges facing families today. Our engagements aren't photo opportunities. They're genuine efforts to make a meaningful difference in people's lives." Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. If anything, her measured response seemed to fuel his determination to push harder. "But isn't there something fundamentally problematic about inherited privilege in the 21st century? You live in palaces while families struggle with housing costs. You wear designer gowns worth thousands while people choose between heating and eating." The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, designed to put Catherine on the defensive. Around the studio, crew members exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the respectful interview they'd expected to witness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Catherine processed what was clearly becoming a hostile interrogation rather than the collaborative discussion she had prepared for. "That's a gross oversimplification of both our role and our lifestyle," Catherine replied, her diplomatic mask beginning to show cracks. "The properties we use are held in trust for the nation. The work we do generates significant economic benefits for the country, and I would challenge anyone to look at my diary and suggest that I'm not fully committed to serving the public good. Stephanopoulos pressed his advantage, sensing he had found a nerve. But serving the public good shouldn't require hereditary titles and taxpayer-funded security details, should it? In an era where every institution is being questioned and reformed, why should the monarchy be exempt from scrutiny about its very existence? The question was philosophical dynamite, designed to force Catherine into defending not just her personal choices, but the entire constitutional framework she represented. Her hands, previously folded calmly in her lap, tensed slightly as she realized just how far Stephanopoulos was willing to push this confrontation. "George, I came here tonight to discuss initiatives that are genuinely helping vulnerable children and families," Catherine said, her voice gaining strength and authority. "If you want to debate constitutional monarchy, perhaps you should have been clearer about your intentions when your producers reached out to my office." The rebuke was delivered with royal precision, but Stephanopoulos showed no signs of retreating. Instead, he seemed energized by her resistance, like a prosecutor who had just gotten the reaction he wanted from a witness. His next words would push this confrontation past the point of polite disagreement into something much more dangerous. "Your Royal Highness, with respect, constitutional questions are exactly what our viewers want answered. The American people fought a revolution to free themselves from royal rule, and many are wondering why we should celebrate or provide platforms for institutions they view as fundamentally undemocratic." The studio fell silent, except for the hum of cameras capturing every micro-expression. Catherine's eyes flashed with something that hadn't been seen before, not anger exactly, but a steel-edged determination that suggested the diplomatic princess was about to show a very different side of herself. The confrontation that was building would soon explode in ways that nobody in that studio could have anticipated, and what happened next would change everything. Catherine leaned forward in her chair, her posture shifting from diplomatic politeness to something far more formidable. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. This was no longer the carefully managed royal we were accustomed to seeing at ribbon cuttings and garden parties. This was someone who had been pushed too far and was about to push back with the full force of her position and intelligence. "George, let me be absolutely clear about something," Catherine began, her voice carrying a new authority that seemed to fill the entire studio. "You've invited me here under false pretenses, and now you're using your platform to launch what can only be described as a politically motivated attack. The American people you claim to speak for include millions who appreciate the cultural and diplomatic ties between our nations." Stephanopoulos' eyebrows shot up, clearly not expecting this level of pushback from someone he had assumed would remain diplomatically restrained regardless of his provocations. The veteran interviewer was used to politicians who would deflect and dodge, but Catherine was doing something far more dangerous. She was calling him out directly on national television. "Your Royal Highness, I'm simply asking questions that reflect legitimate concerns about democratic accountability." Stephanopoulos shot back, but there was a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Surely you can't expect to be immune from the same scrutiny that every other public figure faces." "Scrutiny is one thing, George. What you're doing is something else entirely," Catherine replied, her tone becoming increasingly sharp. "You're not asking about policy or effectiveness. You're questioning the fundamental legitimacy of constitutional frameworks that have served democratic nations for centuries. That's not journalism. That's activism, disguised as an interview." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Around the studio, producers were frantically checking their legal notes, wondering if they were about to witness something that would require damage control. This wasn't going according to anyone's script, and the raw authenticity of the confrontation was creating television that viewers wouldn't be able to turn away from. Stephanopoulos' face flushed slightly, a tell that suggested Catherine had struck a nerve. "I resent the implication that my questioning lacks journalistic integrity. I've been doing this for decades, and I have every right to explore these topics with any guest who appears on this program. And I have every right to point out when those questions cross the line from legitimate inquiry into hostile interrogation," Catherine fired back without missing a beat. Your producers assured my office this would focus on charitable work and mental health initiatives. Instead, you've chosen to ambush me with Republican talking points that have nothing to do with the work I'm actually doing. The word Republican, clearly referring to anti-monarchist sentiment rather than American political parties, was delivered with surgical precision. Catherine was demonstrating that she understood exactly what game Stephanopoulos was playing, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of diplomatic nicety. Stephanopoulos leaned back in his chair, but his retreat was tactical rather than defeated. Perhaps we should discuss some of the more recent controversies then. There have been questions about the royal family's response to various social issues, about transparency in your charitable foundations, about the relevance of monarchy in addressing modern challenges. There it is, Catherine said, a bitter smile crossing her face. When direct attacks on constitutional democracy don't work, pivot to vague accusations about controversies and questions. George, this is beneath you, and it's certainly beneath the standards your network claims to uphold. The personal nature of Catherine's criticism was clearly hitting home. Stephanopoulos' jaw tightened visibly as he processed being called out so directly by someone he had clearly underestimated. The power dynamic in the studio had shifted completely. What had started as an ambush was becoming a masterclass in how to handle hostile media. Your Royal Highness, I think you're being overly sensitive to legitimate journalistic inquiry, Stephanopoulos replied, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Public figures must be prepared to answer difficult questions about their roles and responsibilities. Catherine's laugh was sharp and humorless. Overly sensitive? George, I've sat through hundreds of interviews addressing genuine policy questions, budget concerns, and operational challenges. What you're doing isn't difficult questioning. It's a predetermined narrative, looking for sound bites to support conclusions you've already reached. The accusation of predetermined bias was perhaps the most damaging thing Catherine could have said. For a journalist who prided himself on objectivity, being accused of operating with a predetermined agenda was professional kryptonite. Stephanopoulos' response would determine whether this confrontation escalated further or if he would attempt to salvage some semblance of journalistic credibility. I reject that characterization entirely, Stephanopoulos said, his voice rising slightly. My questions reflect legitimate concerns shared by many Americans about the role of inherited privilege in modern society. And there's the mask slip, Catherine replied immediately. You're not representing American concerns, George. You're pushing your own political agenda, using the authority of this news program as cover. The American people are perfectly capable of forming their own opinions about international relationships and constitutional frameworks without having them spoon-fed through loaded questions. The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Catherine had effectively accused Stephanopoulos of journalistic malpractice on his own show, challenging not just his questions but his entire approach and motivations. The veteran broadcaster was facing a choice: double down on his aggressive tactics and risk further professional damage, or attempt to regain control of an interview that had completely escaped his grasp. What happened next would determine whether this explosive confrontation could be salvaged, or if it would spiral into the kind of television disaster that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The tension in Studio 3A was reaching a breaking point, and viewers could sense that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Stephanopoulos made his fatal mistake in that moment of wounded pride. Instead of acknowledging Catherine's legitimate concerns or attempting to redirect the conversation, he chose to escalate. His face darkened with barely contained frustration as he leaned forward aggressively, pointing his pen directly at the Princess of Wales. Your Royal Highness, with all due respect, you can't waltz into an American television studio and lecture me about journalism when your entire existence is built on a system that denies basic democratic principles. Stephanopoulos snapped, his professional veneer finally cracking completely. You want to talk about predetermined narratives? Your life is literally predetermined by birthright, funded by taxpayers who have no choice in the matter. The studio erupted in shocked silence. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze as they processed what they had just witnessed. Stephanopoulos had crossed every line of professional courtesy and diplomatic protocol simultaneously. His producers in the control room were frantically trying to signal him to pull back, but it was far too late. Catherine's reaction was immediate and devastating in its controlled fury. She slowly removed her microphone, setting it deliberately on the small table beside her chair, with the precision of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their tolerance. When she looked up at Stephanopoulos, her eyes carried the full weight of centuries of royal authority. "George, in 30 years of public service, I have never encountered such unprofessional, disrespectful behavior from a member of the media," Catherine said, her voice deadly quiet but carrying clearly throughout the studio. "You have violated every principle of journalistic ethics, betrayed the trust your producers placed in you, and embarrassed yourself, your network, and your profession." She stood gracefully, her movements fluid despite the obvious tension radiating from her entire being. The simple act of rising seemed to diminish Stephanopoulos in his chair, making him appear small and petty in comparison to her dignified composure under fire. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, now standing at her full height and looking down at the still-seated host, "your personal attacks on constitutional monarchy reveal a fundamental ignorance about how democratic systems actually function. The United Kingdom has been a functioning democracy longer than the United States has existed, and our constitutional framework has inspired democratic movements around the world." Stephanopoulos attempted to interrupt, half rising from his chair. "Your Royal Highness, I think you're overreacting to—" "I am not finished." Catherine cut him off with such authority that he immediately sat back down. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and everyone in the studio could feel it. "You want to talk about predetermined narratives? You invited me here under false pretenses with the sole intention of creating a confrontational spectacle. That's not journalism, George. That's entertainment masquerading as news." The princess moved toward the studio exit, but she wasn't finished delivering her devastating assessment. She turned back to face Stephanopoulos one final time, and what she said next would be replayed across social media and news networks for weeks to come. "The saddest part about this entire debacle is that while you've been busy trying to score political points and create viral moments, we could have had a meaningful conversation about mental health resources that are desperately needed in communities across America," Catherine said, her voice carrying both disappointment and moral authority. "Instead, you chose to waste this platform on your own personal agenda." Stephanopoulos made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Your Royal Highness, surely we can continue this conversation in a more productive—" "No, George, we cannot," Catherine interrupted with finality. "You've made it abundantly clear that you have no interest in productive conversation. You're interested in gotcha moments and manufactured controversy. I won't be part of that circus." She began walking toward the studio exit, her heels clicking against the floor in the profound silence that had fallen over the entire production. The sound seemed to echo with the weight of professional and diplomatic consequences that would ripple far beyond this single interview. But Catherine wasn't quite finished. At the studio door, she paused and delivered her final devastating blow to Stephanopoulos' credibility. "For what it's worth, George, the mental health initiatives we discussed, or rather tried to discuss, have helped over 2 million families across the Commonwealth access crucial support services," she said without turning around. "Perhaps you might consider covering stories like that instead of manufacturing controversies that serve no one except your own ego." With that, Princess Catherine walked out of Studio 3A, leaving behind a stunned Stephanopoulos, a crew of mortified production staff, and what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about interview disasters in television history. Stephanopoulos sat frozen in his chair, his face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning realization of the professional catastrophe he had just created. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of his humiliation as he struggled to process what had just happened. "We'll be right back," he finally managed to stammer, but his voice lacked any of its usual authority. The damage was done, the confrontation was over, and Princess Catherine had emerged not just victorious, but as someone who had exposed the worst tendencies in modern media, while maintaining her dignity throughout the entire ordeal. The studio lights dimmed as they cut to commercial, but the reverberations of this explosive confrontation would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling. In attempting to ambush and diminish Princess Catherine, George Stephanopoulos had instead revealed his own unprofessional bias and created a masterclass in how grace under pressure could triumph over manufactured controversy. The princess had walked out, but she had walked out as the clear winner of this unforgettable television moment.